September 2, 1945. Tokyo Bay, Japan. The deck of the USS Missouri was crowded with admirals, generals, and journalists gathered to witness the formal surrender of the Japanese Empire. Anchored nearby, almost unnoticed among the assembled fleet, sat a battleship that had no business being there at all. 3 years and 9 months earlier, naval officials in Pearl Harbor had written her off as a total loss. 7 torpedoes had torn through her hull. 2 armor-piercing bombs had punched through her deck. She had settled onto the harbor floor in 40 feet of water, her superstructure burning, her captain dead on the bridge. The USS West Virginia was supposed to be a casualty of December 7, 1941. She was supposed to stay at the bottom of Pearl Harbor and never fight again. What she actually did was come back from the dead, cross an entire ocean, and help fire the last shots of the greatest naval war in human history. This is the story of how a battleship that the Japanese believed they had destroyed became one of the most effective warships the United States Navy ever put to sea. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the West Virginia was moored at Battleship Row on the southeastern side of Ford Island, with the USS Tennessee tied alongside her inboard. The attack began at 7:55 in the morning, and the West Virginia absorbed more punishment than nearly any other ship in the harbor. Japanese torpedo bombers from Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had crossed the Pacific in secret, hit her almost immediately. The first torpedo struck her port side at 7:56. Within the next several minutes, 6 more followed. Each one blew open a section of her hull below the waterline. She began listing heavily to port, and without immediate action, she would have capsized completely, taking her entire crew down with her. On the bridge, Captain Mervyn Bennion was struck by a fragment from a bomb that detonated on the Tennessee alongside them. The fragment tore through his abdomen, and it became clear within minutes that his wound was mortal. According to eyewitness accounts from officers who were with him, Bennion refused to be moved. He continued directing his crew from the bridge while severely wounded, asking his officers about the condition of his ship even as he was dying. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his conduct that morning. Below decks, in a story that became one of the most remarkable of the entire attack, a 22-year-old mess attendant named Doris Miller had been collecting laundry when the first explosions shook the ship. Miller had no combat training. As a black sailor in the segregated United States Navy of 1941, he had been assigned to kitchen duties and was barred by Navy policy from serving in a combat role. When he reached the deck and saw the chaos around him, he carried wounded sailors to cover and then did something that was entirely outside the bounds of what the Navy thought he was capable of doing. He manned an unmanned .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun and opened fire on the attacking aircraft. He had never been trained on that weapon. He fired it anyway until he was ordered to abandon ship. Doris Miller was awarded the Navy Cross, the first black American to receive it in the Second World War. Despite the heroism of her crew, the West Virginia could not be saved from sinking that morning. Damage control teams managed to prevent her from capsizing by counter-flooding the starboard compartments, which kept her upright as she settled to the bottom. She came to rest on the harbor floor with her main deck partially above water and her superstructure still burning. When Navy salvage teams finally surveyed the wreck in the days that followed, the damage they found was staggering. 7 torpedo hits had destroyed the entire lower port side of the ship. The flooding was so extensive that when divers entered the submerged compartments, they discovered the remains of 70 crew members who had been trapped alive. Evidence later confirmed that some of them had survived for as many as 16 days after the attack before the air ran out. The official damage assessment declared the West Virginia so severely damaged that full reconstruction might not be worth the effort. Some voices in the Navy argued that the shipyard time and materials required to rebuild her could be better spent on new construction. She had been commissioned in 1923, which made her nearly 20 years old by Pearl Harbor standards. Her propulsion system, her fire control equipment, her entire internal arrangement reflected the thinking of a different era. If she was going to be brought back at all, she would need to be rebuilt almost from the keel up. The decision was made to bring her back. Salvage crews began the work of sealing the torpedo holes with enormous wooden cofferdams bolted over the hull from the outside and pumping out the flooded compartments over a period of months. Yet the West Virginia was finally refloated on May 17, 1942, roughly 5 months after the attack. She was towed to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington, arriving in June of 1942 to begin a reconstruction program that would last nearly 2 years. What emerged from Puget Sound in July of 1944 was almost unrecognizable as the same ship. The old cage masts were gone, replaced by a modern tower superstructure. The anti-aircraft battery had been completely rebuilt and dramatically expanded to deal with the kamikaze threat that American commanders were already anticipating. The fire control systems were replaced with the most advanced radar-directed targeting equipment in the American inventory, then including the Mark 8 fire control radar that could track targets and direct gunfire with a precision that simply had not existed before the war. The propulsion plant had been overhauled and updated. The armor scheme had been reinforced. She was given the latest communications equipment and electronic warfare technology available. The West Virginia that left Puget Sound in 1944 was faster, better armed, better protected, and far more capable than the ship that had been sunk in 1941. She was not repaired. She was remade. She rejoined the Pacific Fleet and participated in the invasion of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines in October of 1944, which triggered the largest naval battle in history. Within that enormous engagement came a smaller but historically decisive action called the Battle of Surigao Strait. She fought in the early hours of October 25, 1944. A Japanese surface force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura was attempting to drive through the strait in the middle of the night to attack the American landing beaches from the south. Waiting for them was a line of American battleships and cruisers in a formation that naval tacticians had dreamed about for centuries. The American fleet was crossing the T, positioning themselves perpendicular to the Japanese line of advance, which meant every American gun could fire broadside, while the Japanese could only fire their forward batteries. The West Virginia opened fire at 17,000 yards in the darkness, using her Mark 8 radar to track and target the Japanese ships with a precision that required no visual contact at all. She fired 93 16-inch shells during the engagement. The Tennessee and California, 2 other Pearl Harbor survivors that had also been rebuilt and returned, fired alongside her. The Japanese force was annihilated. Admiral Nishimura went down with his flagship. Almost no Japanese ships survived to reach the landing beaches. The Battle of Surigao Strait was the last time in history that battleships engaged each other in combat, and the ship that had been written off as a casualty at Pearl Harbor fired the opening salvos and delivered some of the most accurate long-range gunfire of the entire engagement. The West Virginia went on to support amphibious operations at Lingayen Gulf and at Okinawa, where she was hit by a kamikaze attack in April of 1945 and returned to service within weeks. When the Japanese surrender was signed aboard the Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, the West Virginia was anchored in the harbor as a witness. The crew that had been trapped in her flooded compartments in 1941, the captain who had died on her bridge, the mess attendant who had grabbed a gun he had never been trained to fire. All of that was woven into the identity of a ship that was present at both the worst day in American naval history and the final hour of the war. Her story demands honest accounting. The West Virginia was not unique in her general arc. Several other Pearl Harbor battleships were raised, rebuilt, and returned to service, and they all contributed to the American campaign in the Pacific. The Maryland and the Pennsylvania remained in service throughout the war with less extensive reconstruction. The Tennessee and the California followed paths closely parallel to the West Virginia's. The narrative of a single doomed ship rising from the ashes to single-handedly win the war is a simplification of a much larger industrial and military effort that involved hundreds of thousands of workers, engineers, and sailors. The West Virginia did not win the Second World War. The American shipbuilding and repair capacity that could raise a ship sunk by 7 torpedoes, rebuild it to a higher standard than it had been built originally, and return it to combat in under 3 years, all that capacity won the war. But the West Virginia stands as the clearest individual symbol of what that capacity meant. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was designed to permanently destroy American battleship power in the Pacific. It failed, not because the attack was poorly executed, but because the United States possessed the industrial infrastructure and the engineering capability to undo the damage faster than Japanese planners had believed was possible. Every ship raised from that harbor floor was a direct refutation of the strategic logic behind the attack itself. The West Virginia was decommissioned in January of 1947 and sold for scrapping in 1959. Nothing physical remains of her. But on October 25, 1944, in the dark waters of Surigao Strait, the ship that Japanese aviators had sent to the bottom of Pearl Harbor opened fire on the Imperial Japanese Navy with radar-guided 16-inch guns and helped close the final chapter on the age of the battleship. She had been given up for dead, rebuilt into something better than she had ever been, and sent back across the Pacific to finish what had started on the worst Sunday morning in American naval history. That is what the West Virginia actually achieved, and no amount of honest qualification changes the weight of it.